Thank you, Tony, for that wonderful introduction, and you didn't spill the tea about the record. And thank you all for coming out. I know there's a lot of competition with interesting people in other tents, so I'm really grateful for the people that are here, though half of you are my friends, but that's okay. So I begin my book with a personal story that also has historical significance. This is the marriage certificate of my great-great-grandparents, my paternal great-great-grandparents, Alan Morrison and Moses Hunter. Moses was born free in 1835 in South Carolina, though he would become a slave by the time of the Civil War. His mother, Patsy Hunter, was born a slave in South Carolina in 1820, but was freed in childhood. Her stepfather was a free black man named Dublin Hunter, who purchased her mother and at least two of her children, including Patsy. Their freedom was precarious, however, as several of the family members, including Moses, were re-enslaved by 1860, 1850. Ellen was born in 1850 in Elberton, Georgia, which is where she met and married Moses, and that's the family homestead, has been ever since. She was the midwife to family members who are still living. So we tend to think of slavery as a distant past, but there's still family members who knew Ellen and came into the world because of her help. We can trace the ancestry of Ellen and Moses back to two women. On Moses' side, Sally Hunter, who was born in Africa in 1790 and lived in Jamaica before she was brought to South Carolina. And on Ellen's side, the earliest known ancestor is Melinda Morrison, who was born in Henry County, Virginia in 1775. What is striking about my family ancestry is that every woman before Ellen, going back to Sally and Melinda, had children by white men. So my family tree puts in stark relief the preponderance of interracial pairings among my earliest known direct ancestors. It exposes the consequences of sexuality being used as an economic transaction. Black women gave birth to the capital that helped to forge the nation's wealth, typically under the duress of coerced sex with the very men who turned their biracial progeny into commodities. And they also gave birth to children by black men, whom neither mother nor father could claim as their own flesh and blood legally. Black families, as a result, were quite complex in structure. They included people of mixed racial ancestry, of different parentage, and mixed status, meaning both slave and free. But Ellen and Moses shattered at least a century of mostly obligatory interracial pairings. Ellen was the first woman in my direct paternal line to give birth to children by a black man and marry him. They were the first intraracial couple in the family that we know for certain were legally married. Ellen and Moses' marriage certificate is typical of many such documents. When slaves secured their freedom, their citizenship, and a host of rights, including the right to marry. And their story encapsulates many aspects of African American marital love and struggles in the 19th century. Most of their ancestors did not have the same opportunity they did to choose their own mates and marriage partners. Slaves were not allowed to marry legally, though they were allowed to marry informally with their master's permission. When they decided to wed, they were forced to revise the standard wedding vows to reflect their inferior standing. And this is captured by one white preacher, who married a slave couple, officiating at the ceremony. He sort of frankly reminded the couples of their inferior standing by saying, "Until death or distance do part." But a black preacher actually stated the terms differently by assigning blame, by saying, until death or bakra, meaning the white man, part 2. And so for slaves, marriage was not an inviolable union between two people. Their relationships were controlled by masters who could intervene at any time, in any way, most horribly through sexual violations of slave women and separations of spouses. So the rest of my talk, I'm going to talk a little bit about the definition of marriage that I use in the book, and I'm going to give you a sense of the arc of the book, and I'll choose 2 moments, one from slavery, one from the Civil War, and read a little bit, a few paragraphs from the book, and then I'll conclude with some overarching points or arguments about the book. So what is marriage, and how am I using the term? I define marriage as it was understood during and after slavery to encompass committed conjugal relationships, whether legal or not, monogamous, bigamous, polygamous, or serial. Black heterosexual intimacy comprised a wide range of domestic arrangements out of necessity, not all of which were described as marriage. African Americans did maintain relationships that they considered and called marriage, however, despite the lack of support that safely scaffolded European American relationships as sacrosanct. African Americans understood the importance of contesting the standing of their relationships as integral to any prospects that freedom might hold for them on the most basic level. Marriage was important in mainstream society to public standing and recognition of individuals and families, to the enjoyment of social rights, and through exercising personal freedoms. Marriage was by no means synonymous with freedom, but slaves and free blacks knew that their futures as liberated people was less certain without the guarantee of marriage or the right to choose whether or not to wed. How far could they go in the world without beloved kin? The foundation of which was secured on the bedrock of publicly protected marriage. Marriage was at the foundation of liberation because it had been at the foundation of racial subordination. But even as African Americans acknowledged the fundamental civil rights embedded in legal monogamous marriage, they responded in diverse ways to conventional ideas about marriage once they legally secured the right to marry after emancipation. So freedom meant not just access to social conventions, but also the ability to reject them. So I use the term marriage because even white Americans who refused to grant slaves and free blacks inviolable rights often acknowledge that what looked like marriage among African Americans was marriage de facto. The dominating role that marriage played in mainstream society made it difficult to label and account for varieties of intimacy that did not in some way get defined by the sanctioned custom. So blacks and whites alike referred to slave marriage. They did not always understand or share the same ideas about what that term meant and under what circumstances it should be or could be applied to black intimacy. Slave owners considered marriage only those relationships that they affirmed and sanctioned. But ultimately, they could not dictate personal feelings. Sex, both inter and intra-racial, could be thrust upon slaves for whatever purposes enslavers desired. But marriage was ultimately a mutual exchange of affections and services, a chosen emotional and social bond. Persons could be forced to play the role and abide by the form, but that did not make a marriage. So a main objective of my book is to probe this meaning. What did constitute marriage before and after emancipation for African Americans? What did those relationships mean to them? What were the complex ramifications of forming such relationships within the constraints that were imposed upon them? So the book has 8 chapters, and it covers the entire 19th century. It covers both the South and the North. It deals with slaves and free blacks. The first two chapters deal with slavery. The first chapter deals with the everyday relationships of slave marriage. The second chapter deals with slave law. So there weren't laws necessarily against slave marriage, but the laws were articulated. The legal principles of why slaves could not be married were articulated in various court cases. Chapter 3 deals with free blacks, so I deal with relationships of free blacks married to one another, as well as free blacks who were married to slaves. Chapters 4 and 5 deal with the Civil War. I deal with sort of the first slaves who were running away during the Civil War, running to contraband camps, which was the first opportunity that they had to seek refuge under the auspices of the federal government, and also missionaries in the government became involved in actually encouraging them and supporting them in remarrying, what they called under the flag. And I also deal with some of the congressional debates, U.S. Congress debates, Confederate debates with respect to policies, especially around the enlistment of black men that dealt with the marriage and family members of black soldiers in those Civil War chapters. And then in chapters 6 and 7, I deal with reconstruction, the literal reconstruction of the intimate relationships once the Civil War was over, once all the slaves were freed, and I deal with some of the laws that didn't get passed, then affirming former slaves' relationships, and the rise of a kind of new agricultural system, sharecropping, and what that meant for slave families and slave marriage. And then the very last chapter, chapter 8, I deal with the very end of the 19th century. So at that point, I'm sort of assessing where have we been over the course of the book? Where do slave marriages stand by the end of the 19th century, the turn of the 20th century? And I deal with sort of a rising discourse around black respectability, with the emergence of a kind of a black middle class. So these ideas are floating around about the importance of marriage in terms of racial progress, and then I sort of assess the ideals of relationship to the realities. And then I end the book with the epilogue, which is about the 20th century. And it sort of looks very broadly at trends over the course of the 20th century, and especially what happens around 1940 when there's a kind of growing racial gap in marriage. White marriage rates start to go up, black marriage rates start to go down. And I sort of engaged some of the discourse around commentators, scholars, pundits who argue that marriage today among African Americans is a product of slavery, and I challenged that idea. So that's the kind of the arc of the book. So I tried to paint portraits of black marital relationships without idealizing or sentimentalizing them. And I've tried to depict them with both the sensitivity and the complexity they deserve to underscore what these relationships meant to black people, how they functioned, how they were sustained or disrupted, how they were perceived within communities, and why and how they were rejected at times. I've tried to depict characters in the book that expose all their humanity. African Americans struggled to create sexual and intimate pairings under extraordinary circumstances. But they also had to face all the regular burdens that heterosexual couples have negotiated. So imagine your marriages in the context of slavery and the ways that you have to negotiate. And couples had to negotiate from time immemorial forbidden love, unrequited love, extramarital affairs, spats over spouses that end sometimes in murder of rebels. These dramas unfold in a diversity of written records that African Americans were never fully private. Many of them have been preserved, especially in the National Archives. We have this amazing treasure trove of records, especially for the Civil War Reconstruction period. A sample of these records include, for example, a breakup letter written by an errant husband, the desperate plea of a wife to get her soldier husband to return to her and their children after the war, while he appears to be on the land, living close by. Or the testimony of Civil War widows who are trying to keep their pensions in the face of nosy neighbors and federal investigators who claim that they cohabit with men, which is in violation of the pension rules. So these are just a few examples of how everyday qualities of intimate relationships, marriage making and marriage breaking, are revealed in the book. So I'm going to read a couple of passages, and one deals with sort of some of the complications that result from slaves being separated. Involuntary separations often led to overlapping entanglements. Despite the fact that the separations were usually decided by the masters, they created emotional turmoil and conflict that slaves had to resolve. Should couples continue to honor their relationships, even when they separated and were separated by long distances? How long should they continue to hold out the possibility of reunion? Separations that led to subsequent relationships might also eventually lead to repair and reunion years later. Women and men were often involved in several relationships, sometimes leaving or separated from the same spouse and later getting back together again. New partners on either or both sides, however, could complicate reunions. One couple, both fugitives, for example, accidentally met on the street one day. When they recognized each other, the woman's first words were, "Dear, are you married?" When the answer was returned in the affirmative, she shrank from his embrace, hung her head, and wept, according to a witness. The man thus proceeded to introduce his old and new wives to each other. Though the couple was considered divorced according to the standards of slavery, they each felt a moral obligation to honor a relationship they had not willingly breached. The husband decided to provide a weekly stipend for his first wife. The man essentially had two wives, although he had been satisfied with just one. Whatever vows had been spoken to the first wife, he was bound and determined to keep, even if it required a bigamous arrangement to accomplish. And this is the beginning of the Civil War chapter, Marriage Under the Flag. Lucinda and Solomon Sibley were both slaves in Hinds County, Mississippi, on the same plantation. They were married at the home of their master, Hamilton Sibley, around 1849. Solomon ran away to join the Union Army in December 1863, and his regiment was posted in Helena, Arkansas. Lucinda and their children followed him and lived in a nearby contraband camp, a settlement of fugitive slaves, and their families would join Union forces. On May 14, 1864, the couple was married again by an Army chaplain, Reverend J.R. Locke, an event their son Hannibal recalled witnessing. As Lucinda explained it, to quote her, "There was a general impression that our old slave marriages were not valid, and we were advised to marry again under the United States regulations." Similar scenes took place across the slaveholding states as the Union Army advanced its troops. Civilians and soldiers were given opportunities to formalize slave marriages under a new authority. The federal government embarked into mostly unknown territory, assuming functions that had been previously considered the prerogative of the states. Former slaves adopted the phrase "marriage under the flag" to refer to those ceremonies of remarriage and sometimes first marriages, which capture many meanings about the transitional nature of their former relationships and of their status as dispossessed chattel property. In some cases, ceremonies were officiated by military officers and army chaplains, literally below flags flying above or nearby. The United States flag emblazoned many of the certificates that served as concrete proof of their significance and became a powerful symbol redefining former slaves' intimate relationships. So the Civil War is really an important turning point in the book, and because it's an important turning point in terms of marriage for African Americans. So the book describes a history of African American marriage in the 19th century that teaches us about a pattern that was continually replicated. And the pattern is one of twists and turns, of intimate bonds being formed, sustained, broken, and repeatedly reconstituted under oppressive conditions. It is important to understand that slaves were not allowed all the privileges associated with legal marriage, because this helped to perpetuate the system of slavery as a permanent inheritable condition. The denial of legal rights allowed masters to control women's sexuality, to control the children they reproduce, to control the fruits of their labor, and ultimately to make huge profits. But it's also important to note that race, and not just slavery, established the basis for denigrating intimate bonds. African Americans, regardless of status, Northern and Southern, free and slave, faced harsh reprisals because of racist ideas and practices. Marriage and slavery were always seen as oppositional in society, and even African Americans themselves struggle with reconciling the two. Enslaved people wrestle with whether to wed, whether to wait, under what circumstances. Some postponed it in hopes that they would become free first, making it even a motivation for many slaves to become fugitives. But others relented, most relented to its embrace, doing the best that they could to make their relationships meaningful. During the Civil War, and especially once the Civil War was over and all the slaves were freed, most African Americans moved to legalize their existing relationships or enter into first marriages as legal spouses. And so my great-great-grandparents, Ellen and Moses Hunter, married during this period of Reconstruction. Their marriage was in 1872, even though they started having children just shortly after the Civil War. Many other informal domestic arrangements that had of necessity flourished under slavery persisted in freedom. In essence, marriage patterns continue to be complex, and the legacy of slavery would not be wiped away so easily. Common law marriage, serial marriage, overlapping relationships, and non-marital parenting all coexisted, with some individuals moving in and out of different configurations over their lifespans. Slavery was foundational in marking Black intimacy in ways that have defined marriage and familial relationships as intractable problems ever since, as is articulated in our nation's public discourse and in policymaking up to today. Black family and marital status have always been used as barometers to measure African American fitness for civilization and citizenship. But the measurements have never been fairly discerned or based on the material realities of Black life. Black marriages and families are always collectively judged to fail the test of what is assumed to be normal. And yet those familial relations have also been subjected to continual disruptions, violations, impositions, negations caused by larger economic, social, and political forces at every turn in American history. They've never been left to rise or fall on their own accord. A little behind in the slide, sorry. And yet, despite the reign of terror that slavery spawned, and no matter how much it altered and disfigured Black marriages, it did not and could not annihilate them. African Americans lived and loved, were creative, resourceful, and resilient in building marital forms and kinship ties that function for their survival. We should never lose sight of the depth of feelings that function, the depth of feelings and affection that undergirded those relationships, and the sacrifices that Blacks were willing to make for the sake of preserving them. My ancestors, Ellen and Moses, faced great obstacles in securing their marriages, and yet they did. By the end of the 19th century, the turn of the 20th century, legal marriage had become the norm for their descendants and nearly all adult African Americans. Thank you. Thank you. Thanks.
We have time for questions. I would ask whoever has one if they would please step up to the mic.
Don't be shy.
Oh boy, Tony's going to ask a question.
Softball question. Expanding on the story you told about the fugitives meeting on this street, about complications with after the war, with inheritance, with, I mean, all the many ways in which this situation of generally forced to have multiple partners, how that could play out.
Yeah. So things get really messy after the Civil War, after Reconstruction. As I said, marriage was not legal, so once the war is over, Southern states, at first they're resistant to actually formalizing slave marriages, but eventually in the late 1860s, most states by the late 1860s, most states have begun to pass laws basically sanctifying those relationships, sometimes retroactively sacralizing slave marriages. And so, but that creates some complications because in some cases the states just recognize in the marriages without asking slaves to formally go and register their relationship, so it kind of assumes that you're married to the person that you're with. Well, what if you don't necessarily want to be married with the person that you're with? So these new laws created all kinds of encumbrances. And so I talk about some of the ironies that also some states then start to pass laws punitive laws, punishing former slaves for not getting married, punishing former slaves for bigamy, punishing them for adultery. And so you have these sexual infractions where, practices that were basically necessary under slavery now become criminalized in the Reconstruction period and after. And then we have these court cases that come up in the end of the 19th century. Often, Tony mentioned cases of inheritance. So now judges have to wrestle with these laws. So even though many states passed laws saying now former slaves are legally married, it didn't automatically mean that those marriages would be recognized. So just to give you a concrete example, if you were a former slave and you had an inheritance, you wanted to pass on property to your children, your right to do that might be challenged by the fact that under slavery you had a slave marriage that was not legal. So it gets really messy and complicated after the Civil War, Reconstruction.
Hi, I have two quick questions. One is if you could say something about how it relates to 20th century debates about the black family and whether it, refers to slavery. The second, in a lot of what I hear you talking about, I hear it as sort of the slaves as agents of marriage, and I'm wondering how it factored on plantations when masters were either enforcing mates upon one another or marriages. I don't know how often it was just sort of reproduction or if it was through marriage.
Right, so to answer the second question first, there are definitely coerced relationships under slavery. And so So slaves are constantly struggling with creating their own relationships versus having relationships imposed upon them. And so one of the points that I try to make in the book is that even when those relationships, when they are forced, say, to be in a relationship that they don't want to be in, and it could be both women and men are forced against their will to be in a relationship with one another, and it's often for the purposes of reproduction, that doesn't necessarily mean that that couple considered themselves to be married. So the master might think of them as married. They might relent to that relationship, or they might not. And one way of rejecting that would be to continue a relationship with the person who's considered to be their true love interest. So those relationships are always being contested in that way. They're always struggling to have the relationships they want be recognized. And then you see the consequences after the Civil War, where slaves who've been forced together to be in relationships that they don't want to be in, they often reconnect with those love interests once the war is over. And then sometimes you have these entanglements where you have, couples where they're like 4 pairs of people who, have these other relationships that they're trying to recover and repair. So in terms of the 20th century, so this is what I take up in the epilogue. So some people have argued that today's marriage rate, which is about 30-ish%, less than 40%, so maybe 30% of African Americans are married today, adults are married today, that we can assign responsibility and blame for that rate on slavery. And I argue that that is not true. That by the end of the 19th century, the beginning of the 20th century, African Americans are married nearly universally. And they're actually marrying slightly ahead of whites because they're marrying early. They're marrying younger than whites. So that's a dramatic decline from 1900 to 2017. So how does slavery get blamed for that arc? You can't make that argument, though some people do. And so what I argue, and I'm not unique in this, sociologists have made this argument as well, some sociologists, that we need to look to things that have happened more recently to explain the decline of marriage among African Americans. And the decline really starts post-1940s. So think of the GI Bill, and think of all that it did to create the middle class. Most of the people who benefited from that were white people. African American veterans did not get those benefits to the same degree because they were basically distributed, at the will of states, meaning Jim Crow states could decide whether or not to give them or not. And so there's discrimination in the provision of those bills, of those resources. Part of the purpose of the GI Bill was to actually encourage marriage, to get those veterans, bring them back home, get them resettled into civic life, help them, have the resources to start their families, educational loans, business loans, et cetera, et cetera. So it did what it was designed to do for white families. Meanwhile, African American marriage rates started to decline. So we had this growing gap from 1940s up to the present between white and black marriage rates. One of the forces that historically contributes to the decline of marriage is economic issues. You can almost track it, and again, some scholars, sociologists have tracked this from the time since we've had data going back to the late 19th century showing how marriage and the job market, especially for men, are closely correlated. So another thing that happens post-1940s is permanent unemployment starts to creep up for African Americans. Every decade since the 1940s, permanent unemployment has grown. So you have economic distress, and then you have mass incarceration. So you're literally taking away mostly young men, but often young women as well, in their prime ages. You also have health mortality, premature deaths. So the combination of all those factors have reduced the marriage rates for African Americans. So it's to make the argument that slavery is responsible is to make an ideological argument. It's not an empirical argument, because the empirical data actually shows that that's not the case. So.
You know what? I'm sorry, but we must go on to the next speaker. All right, last one.
This will be quick.
Okay.
Did the end of Reconstruction have any major impact on the arc of marriage, of African-American marriage?
Yes, so I mean, maybe I've emphasized the negatives to a large degree here, but certainly having legal marriage was a huge achievement. So it's one of the first civil rights. Probably up until recently, you know, with the debates about gay marriage, people didn't really think of marriage as a civil right, but actually it is a civil right. And so it's one of the first civil rights that African Americans are able to exercise. And it becomes really one of the few civil rights that doesn't then get challenged, you know, over the next many decades. So the achievement of that right was a hard-fought right, and we can attribute the laws that were passed during Reconstruction for that. And so now, as a result of that, now African Americans are able to secure their families, they're able to protect their children, they're able to limit the sexual violations of women, and that becomes really important, but it's a continuing struggle, because then the next sort of agricultural system that takes the place of slavery is sharecropping. And so the struggles continue, but marriage is secured as a civil right.